My name is Hannah, and I'm 32, living in a quiet Ohio town. I'm that librarian who bikes to work always carrying cash. Groceries, rent, even a kid's birthday cake at the bakery I pay with crumpled bills. People whisper, wondering why I avoid cards or checks. They don't know it started with my mother's trembling voice urging me to keep secrets. There's a reason behind every dollar, a story I've hidden for years. Can you relate to holding a secret close, like and subscribe to uncover why I live this way? I pedaled down Maple Street, the morning air sharp against my cheeks. My backpack heavy with library books and my mother's old leather wallet tucked inside. The town was waking up with kids chasing each other near the diner, and old Mr. Thompson watering his roses. I loved these quiet moments where I could blend in, just another face in our small Ohio world. But lately, blending in felt harder. People were starting to notice things about me. Things I'd spent years keeping under wraps. At the library, I unlocked the front door, the familiar creak greeting me like an old friend. My desk was a mess of bookmarks and overdue notices, but I liked the chaos. It kept me busy, kept my mind off the whispers. I was sorting through a stack of returns when Tessa bounced in, her ponytail swinging. She was my coworker, barely 25, with a smile that could charm anyone. But her curiosity, that was trouble. "Morning, Hannah?" she chirped, dropping her bag on the counter. "You biking in this cold, you're tougher than me." I smiled, shrugging. "Keeps me awake. You try shelving books half asleep." She laughed, but her eyes flicked to my backpack. "You always carry that thing. What's in it, gold bars?" My stomach tightened, but I kept my tone light. "Just books and my lunch. Nothing exciting." Tessa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Come on, you're like a mystery novel. Always cash, no cards, no Venmo. What's the deal?" I froze my fingers, pausing on a paperback. She'd asked before, but today her tone was different, sharper, like she was digging for something. I forced a laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "I'm old school, Tessa. Cash is simple." She didn't push, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I turned away, busying myself with the computer, my heart thudding. I'd always been careful paying for everything in cash, just like my mother taught me. Rent, groceries, even the new tires for my bike last month, all in crisp or crumpled bills. It was my routine, my shield. But Tessa's questions were a crack in that shield, and I didn't like it. Later that day, the town fair sprawled across the park with booths selling pies and kids tugging balloons. I wandered through my wallet, snug in my pocket. The air smelled of popcorn and cotton candy, and for a moment, I felt normal, like I belonged. I stopped at a raffle booth, fishing out a few dollars for a ticket. The prize was a quilt hand-stitched by the church ladies, and I imagined it draped over my couch. As I handed over the bills, Mrs. Clara's voice cut through the chatter. She was at the next booth, her silver hair pinned tight, her eyes locked on me. "Who carries that much cash anymore?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Most folks use cards these days." Heads turned. A couple of women nearby nodded, their gazes lingering. My cheeks burned, and I fumbled with the ticket, shoving it into my pocket. "It's just easier," I mumbled, but Clara's lips pursed like she'd caught me in a lie. I walked away, my pulse racing, the fair's noise fading into a dull hum. Clara was the town's unofficial gossip, always sniffing out stories. I'd heard her talk about everyone, the mayor's divorce, the baker's gambling debts, but now her spotlight was on me, and it felt like 1,000 needles. I slipped behind a tent, leaning against a tree, my fingers brushing the wallet in my pocket. It was worn, the leather soft, from years of use, my mother's initials DM, barely visible on the clasp. I closed my eyes, and there she was, my mother, Diane, in our old kitchen. I was 12, perched on a stool, watching her count cash under the flickering light. Her hands shook, her nails bitten to the quick. "Never let them trace you, Hannah," She'd said, her voice low, like she was sharing a dangerous secret. I didn't understand then, but I nodded, memorizing her every move. She'd stuffed the bills into that wallet, her eyes darting to the window as if someone might be watching. The memory faded, and I opened my eyes, the fair's music pulling me back. I wanted to believe Clara's comment was nothing, just her usual meddling. But as I rejoined the crowd, I caught her whispering to another woman, their glances darting my way. My stomach churned. This wasn't just curiosity. It was suspicion, and it was spreading. Back at my apartment that night, I sat on my bed, the wallet open in my lap. I counted the bills inside a habit I'd picked up from my mother. 10 20s, 5 10s, a handful of ones. It wasn't much, but it felt like armor, a way to stay invisible. Yet tonight, it didn't calm me. Clara's words echoed, and Tessa's questions gnawed. I thought about my mother, how she'd lived in shadows, always looking over her shoulder. Was I doing the same? Was I hiding for no reason? I tucked the wallet under my pillow like I did every night and turned off the lamp. But sleep didn't come. I kept seeing Clara's pursed lips, Tessa's probing eyes, and somewhere deep inside my mother's voice whispered, warning me to stay careful. But careful wasn't enough anymore. People were watching, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep them at bay. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that lingers like damp air after a storm. I pulled the wallet from under my pillow, its leather cool against my fingers, and slipped it into my jeans. The apartment was quiet, just the hum of the fridge and the faint chirp of birds outside. I wanted to shake off Clara's words, Tessa's questions, but they clung to me sharp and stubborn. At the library, I kept my head down, shelving books with a rhythm that usually steadied me. The smell of old pages and wood polish was comforting, but today, it felt like a thin shield. Tessa was at the front desk, chatting with a patron, her laughter bright but grating. I avoided her, slipping into the children's section to organize picture books. The colorful covers with their smiling animals and sunny skies felt like a world I didn't belong to. Around noon, I grabbed my lunch from the break room fridge, a sandwich I'd packed in wax paper. Tessa was there sipping coffee, her phone glowing in her hand. She looked up, her eyes catching mine. "Hannah, you got a sec?" I hesitated, my sandwich halfway to my mouth. "Sure," I said, though. My gut said to walk away. She slid her phone across the table, the screen showing a grainy photo. My breath caught. It was me, maybe 15, standing next to my mother outside our old house. My hair was in a messy braid, and my mother's arm was around me, her smile tight, like she was forcing it. The photo was from a life I'd buried, one I hadn't shared with anyone here. "Where'd you get that?" My voice was sharp, louder than I meant. Tessa flinched, but didn't back down. "I found it online, some old community page. I was just curious about you, Hannah. You never talk about your family." My hands shook as I pushed the phone back. "You had no right. That's private." "I was trying to help," she said, her tone defensive. "You're so closed off. I thought maybe there's something you're scared of." I stood my chair, scraping the floor. "Don't dig into my life, Tessa. Just don't." I left the break room, my sandwich forgotten, my heart pounding like it wanted to break free. The library felt smaller, the walls closing in. I hid in the storage closet, surrounded by boxes of donated books, and pressed my palms to my eyes. That photo wasn't just a picture. It was my mother's laughter on rare good days, the creak of our porch swing, the life we had before she got sick. Tessa had no business touching it. By afternoon, I was back at my desk, pretending to work, when I overheard two patrons near the magazines. Clara said she saw that librarian at the fair paying with a wad of cash, one whispered. "Sounds like she's hiding something. Probably illegal," the other replied, her voice low but clear. "Why else avoid banks?" My throat tightened. I kept my eyes on my computer typing nonsense to look busy, but their words burned. Clara wasn't just gossiping now. She was planting seeds and they were taking root. I glanced at the clock, willing the day to end. But the library was my haven, and even that felt tainted. When my shift ended, I biked to the corner store needing milk and something to distract me. The clerk, a guy named Sam, rang me up as I handed over a 10. He paused, looking at the bill, then at me. "You always got cash," he said, not quite a question. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Habit?" He nodded, but his eyes lingered like he was piecing together a puzzle. I left with my milk, the bag swinging against my handlebars, and rode past the park. The fair was gone, the grass trampled, but Clara's voice echoed in my head, her accusation now a chorus with the town's whispers. At home, I locked the door and sank onto my couch, the wallet in my hands. I didn't count the bills this time. Instead, I traced the stitching worn from years of my mother's grip, then mine. I thought of her, how she'd sit at our kitchen table, her hair falling over her face as she sorted money. She'd hum sometimes a soft tune I couldn't place, but her eyes were always distant, like she was somewhere else. I'd asked her once when I was 13 why we never used cards. She'd looked at me, her gaze heavy, and said, "Cards leave trails, Hannah. Trails can find you." I didn't push, but I'd felt it then, the weight of something bigger, something she wouldn't share. Now, with Tessa's photo and Clara's rumors, that weight was mine, and it was heavier than ever. I set the wallet on the coffee table and stared at it, my mind racing. Tessa's meddling wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. If she'd found that photo, what else could she uncover? And Clara, she wasn't stopping. I imagined her at the diner spinning stories about me, each one wilder than the last. The town was small, and gossip was its lifeblood. I'd seen it ruin people the way it had with the high school principal years ago, accused of stealing funds. He'd left his name wrecked, and I wasn't about to let that happen to me. But what could I do? Confront Tessa, call out Clara? Every option felt like stepping into a spotlight I'd avoided my whole life. My mother's voice was there, soft but firm. "Stay invisible, Hannah." But staying invisible wasn't working. The whispers were louder, the stares bolder, and I was running out of places to hide. I woke to the sound of rain tapping my window, the gray light matching the ache in my chest. The wallet sat on my coffee table untouched from last night, its presence heavier than ever. I wanted to shove it in a drawer, forget the whispers, but Clara's voice, Tessa's photo, the clerk's stare. They were a chorus I couldn't silence. I dressed quickly, pulling on a sweater and jeans, and biked to the library, the wet pavement hissing under my tires. The library was quiet, the kind of hush that usually soothed me. But today, it felt like a trap, every creak of the floorboards a warning. I was reshelving mysteries when a group of kids came in for story hour, their laughter sharp against my mood. I forced a smile, setting up chairs, but my hands trembled. Clara's words at the fair, the patrons' whispers at the store, they were spreading, and I felt them in every glance. By mid-morning, Tessa was at the front desk, her usual chatter absent. I avoided her, focusing on cataloging new arrivals, but I could feel her watching me. I wanted to confront her about the photo demand she stopped digging, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I hid in the biography section, pretending to organize my fingers, brushing spines of lives laid bare. I envied those people, their stories out in the open, no secrets to guard. At lunch, I slipped out to the park across the street, needing air. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the cloudy sky. I sat on a bench, my lunch uneaten in my lap, and watched a couple push a stroller, their easy laughter a world away. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to my brother Ethan's number. We hadn't talked in months, not since he'd moved to Chicago, but I needed someone who knew my mother, who might understand. "Hey, Hannah," he answered, his voice groggy. "What's up?" I swallowed my throat tight. "People here are talking, Ethan, about my cash, about Mom. They think I'm hiding something." He sighed, the sound heavy through the phone. "You're being paranoid like she was. Just ignore them." Paranoid. My voice cracked. "They're calling me a criminal, Ethan. Clara, this old lady, she's got the whole town stirred up." "Then move," he said like it was that simple. "You don't owe them anything." I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. "This is my home. I shouldn't have to run." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom's gone, Hannah. You don't have to live like her." I hung up my eyes, stinging. Ethan's dismissal hurt worse than Clara's gossip. He was supposed to get it to remember how our mother lived, always cautious, always cash. But he'd left that life behind, and I was still carrying it. I shoved my phone in my pocket and headed back to the library, the weight of his words settling like damp clothes. The afternoon dragged, and I was checking out books for a regular Mrs. Larson when the library doors swung open. Clara walked in, her purse clutched tight, her eyes scanning the room. My stomach dropped. She wasn't here for books. She marched to the children's section where we were hosting a reading event, parents and kids sprawled on colorful rugs. I followed, my heart thudding, knowing she was up to something. Tessa was reading a picture book, her voice animated, but Clara interrupted, her voice carrying like a bell. "Hannah, a word please. We need to talk about your habits." The room went still. Parents looked up, kids squirmed, and Tessa faltered, closing the book. I stood frozen, my hands clenching the edge of a table. "This isn't the place, Clara." I said, my voice low, but it shook. "Oh, I think it is," she said, stepping closer, her silver hair glinting under the lights. "Folks deserve to know who's handling their library." "Why do you live like a fugitive, always cash no trace?" My face burned, every eye on me. A mother pulled her kid closer, and a man in the back whispered to his wife. I wanted to scream, to tell them I wasn't a criminal, that my mother's fear wasn't my crime, but my throat closed, and all I could manage was, "You don't know me." Clara's lips curled, not quite a smile. "Maybe we should." I turned and walked out, my boots echoing on the hardwood tears, blurring my vision. Outside, the air was cold, biting my cheeks as I leaned against the library wall. My chest heaved, rage and shame twisting inside me. Clara hadn't just gossiped this time. She'd ambushed me, stripped me bare in front of everyone. And Tessa, she'd stood there silent, her earlier betrayal still raw. I thought of my mother, how she'd flinch at loud voices, how she'd check the locks twice before bed. I'd promised to keep her secret, whatever it was, but it was suffocating me now. Clara's accusation wasn't just words. It was a blade cutting into the life I'd built. And the worst part, I didn't know how to fight back without unraveling everything my mother had died to protect. I stood outside the library, my breath fogging in the cold, my hands pressed against the brick wall to keep from shaking. Clara's words echoed in my skull, her accusations slicing deeper with every replay. The street was empty, just wet leaves plastered to the sidewalk, but I felt exposed, like the whole town was watching. I wanted to go back inside, grab my bike and ride until I was somewhere else, anywhere else. But my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck, pinned by the weight of their stares. Back in the library, I slipped through the side door, avoiding the children's section where voices had picked up again. Tessa was at the front desk, her eyes flicking to me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my backpack and ducked into the staff bathroom, locking the door. The mirror showed a stranger, my face pale, my brown eyes wide, with something close to panic. I splashed water on my cheeks, but it didn't wash away the humiliation. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Tessa. "I'm sorry about Clara. Can we talk? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Sorry didn't undo her digging her photo, her pushing into a past I'd kept locked. I deleted the message and shoved the phone away, my chest tight with a mix of anger and betrayal. Tessa wasn't my friend, not really. She was just another person trying to unravel me. I left the bathroom and headed to my desk, hoping to lose myself in work. But the library felt different now, like a house I no longer belonged in. I was sorting through a pile of returns when I noticed a man lingering near the reference section, his baseball cap low over his eyes. It was Nathan, a regular who came in for history books. He'd always been friendly quick with a joke, but today his posture was stiff, his glance uneasy. "Hey, Hannah," he said, approaching my desk, his voice low. "Heard what happened. Clara's out of line, but people are talking. They're saying weird stuff about you." My stomach twisted. "What kind of stuff?" He shifted, scratching his neck. "Just rumors. Like maybe you're hiding money or you're mixed up in something shady." "I don't buy it, but it's getting loud." I gripped the edge of my desk, my nails digging into the wood. "I'm not hiding anything," I said, but my voice cracked, betraying me. "I just pay with cash." "That's it." Nathan nodded, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "I know. Just thought you should hear it from someone who's not Clara." He walked away, leaving me with a sinking feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath me. The rest of the day was a blur, my hands moving through tasks while my mind spiraled. I kept seeing Clara's smug face, Nathan's awkward warning, the parents' whispers during the reading event. By closing time, I was drained, my body heavy as I locked up. I biked home slowly, the chill seeping through my sweater, and let myself into my apartment. The quiet was oppressive, the kind that amplifies every thought. I dropped my backpack and sank onto the floor, my back against the couch. The wallet was still on the coffee table, its leather catching the lamplight. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and opened it to find a folded piece of paper I'd never noticed before. It was yellowed, the ink faded, but my mother's handwriting was unmistakable. "We owe him, Hannah," it read. "But he'll never find us if we're careful." Below that, a name, Richard. My heart stopped. Richard was my father, a man my mother rarely spoke of, always with a shadow in her eyes. I'd been 5 when she left him, too young to remember much, but her fear was vivid, etched into my childhood. This note, though, was new, a piece of her I didn't know. Owe him what? Money? Something worse? The word careful burned a reminder of her rules, her cash, her secrets I'd inherited without understanding. I folded the note, my hands unsteady, and tucked it back into the wallet. My mother's life was a maze, and I was lost in it. Her warnings now, my prison. I thought of calling Ethan again, but his earlier dismissal stung too much. He'd made it clear he wanted no part of this, leaving me alone with the truth I couldn't face. I curled up on the floor, the carpet rough against my cheek, and let the tears come silent but heavy. The next morning, I was back at the library, my eyes red but hidden behind glasses. I was shelving cookbooks when Tessa cornered me, her voice soft but insistent. "Hannah, I know you're mad, but I was looking out for you. I found something about your mom, some old records. I think she was running from someone." I spun to face her, my voice low and sharp. "Stop it, Tessa. You're not helping. You're making it worse." Her face fell, but she pressed on. "I'm trying to understand why you're so scared. Those records, they mentioned a man, someone dangerous." I stepped closer, my hands clenched. "You had no right to look." "None. Leave my mother out of this." She backed off, her eyes wide, but the damage was done. Her words churned in my head, mixing with the note with Nathan's warning with Clara's attack. I felt like I was drowning, every breath harder than the last. And then, as I turned to walk away, I saw a flyer on the bulletin board, fresh and bold, library board meeting, addressing staff concerns. My name wasn't on it, but I knew. Clara had escalated her crusade, and now my job, my life here was on the line. I stood there staring at the flyer, my pulse roaring in my ears. The town wasn't just whispering anymore. It was closing in, and I was running out of places to hide. My mother's note, Tessa's digging Clara's accusations, they were a storm, and I was caught in the center with no way out. The library board meeting was set for Thursday evening, and by the time I woke that morning, my stomach was a knot of dread. I hadn't slept, not really, just drifted through fragments of dreams where my mother's face blurred into shadows. Her note, tucked back in the wallet, sat on my nightstand like a weight I couldn't lift. I dressed in my best blouse, a pale blue one I rarely wore, hoping it would make me feel stronger. It didn't. I biked to work, the air thick with the promise of rain, my mind racing with what Clara might say, what the board might decide. The library was a ghost town, the usual hum of patrons replaced by an eerie quiet. I kept busy reorganizing the reference section, but every tick of the clock felt like a countdown. Tessa avoided me, her shifts rearranged so we barely crossed paths. I was grateful for the space, but it left me alone with my thoughts, and they were merciless. What if the board fired me? What if Clara's rumors followed me, tainting every job, every town I saw my mother's life in? Mine, always running, always hiding, and it terrified me. By noon, I couldn't stand the silence. I locked the library and walked to the diner, needing noise people, anything to drown out the fear. The place was packed, the clatter of plates and chatter, a brief distraction. I slid into a booth, ordering coffee I didn't want, and stared out the window. Across the street, the library loomed, its brick facade steady, but no longer safe. I pulled out my phone, hesitating, then texted Ethan. "Board meeting tonight. They might fire me. I'm scared." He didn't reply, and the silence stung worse than his earlier dismissal. Back at the library, I was shelving travel guides when the door chimed. It was Greg, my landlord, his flannel shirt damp from the drizzle starting outside. He'd always been kind, accepting my cash rent without a fuss, but today his face was serious. "Heard about the meeting," he said, leaning against the counter. "You okay?" I shrugged, my throat tight. "Not really. Clara's got everyone thinking I'm some kind of crook." He nodded, his eyes soft. "My sister went through something like that years ago. People judging, not knowing the half of it. You don't deserve this, Hannah." His words were a lifeline, but they couldn't untangle the mess inside me. I thanked him and turned back to my work, but his presence lingered, a reminder that not everyone saw me as Clara did. Still, it wasn't enough to quiet the panic building with every hour. The meeting was at 6 in the library's community room, a space usually filled with book clubs and craft nights. I arrived early, my hands clammy, and helped set up chairs, a task that kept me moving. The board members trickled in, 5 of them, all familiar faces from town events. There was Mrs. Harper, the retired teacher who loved mysteries, Mr. Coleman, the hardware store owner, and others I'd smiled at for years. Now their expressions were guarded, and I felt like a stranger in their eyes. Clara arrived last, her purse clutched like a weapon, her gaze locking onto me as she took a seat in the front row. A few other townsfolk joined, including Nathan, who gave me a small nod, and a woman I recognized from the diner, her face unreadable. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and I stood at the side, my arms crossed to hide my trembling. Mrs. Harper called the meeting to order, her voice clipped. "We're here to discuss concerns about library staff conduct, specifically Hannah's financial practices." She glanced at me, not unkindly, but it still cut. "Clara, you raised the issue. Please explain." Clara stood, smoothing her skirt, her voice clear and sharp. I've seen Hannah pay for everything in cash, large amounts, no cards, no checks. It's suspicious. We don't know where that money comes from, and as a community, we deserve transparency from someone handling public resources. The room murmured heads nodding, and my chest tightened. I wanted to speak to defend myself, but my mouth was dry, my thoughts a jumble. Mr. Coleman leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Hannah, can you explain why cash only? It does raise questions. I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, the door swung open and Tessa walked in. Her face flushed. She didn't sit, didn't look at the board, just marched to the center of the room. I have something to say, she said, her voice shaking, but loud. I hired a private investigator to look into Hannah's background because I was worried about her. He found records about her mother Diane and a man named Richard, her father. My heart stopped. The room spun every eye on me, but I couldn't look away from Tessa. She kept going, her words a flood I couldn't stop. Richard was a fraudster convicted years ago. Diane fled him, used cash to stay off the grid. The investigator said Richard died a decade ago, but Diane kept hiding, maybe from his associates. Hannah's been living like her, using cash to stay invisible. The air left my lungs. I gripped the wall, my knees weak, as Tessa's words tore open my life. My mother's fear, her secrets, the note about Richard. It was all true. And now it was exposed, raw, and bleeding in front of everyone. Clara gasped, whispering to the woman next to her, and the board members exchanged looks, their faces a mix of shock and pity. Nathan stared at the floor, and Greg, standing at the back, shook his head, his jaw tight. I wanted to scream, to tell Tessa she'd betrayed me again, worse than the photo, worse than anything. But all I could do was stand there, my mother's life laid bare, her pain now mine. The room was a blur of voices, questions, but I couldn't hear them. All I heard was my mother's whisper, "Never let them find you," and the shattering realization that I'd been hiding from a ghost, a man long dead, a debt I didn't understand. My eyes burned, tears spilling, and I turned, pushing past the chairs, needing to escape before I broke completely. I stumbled into the hallway, the community room's voices a muffled roar behind me. My chest heaved, tears streaming, but I couldn't stop. I needed airspace, anything to escape the weight of Tessa's words, the board's stares, Clara's triumph. The library's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the tiled floor. I pushed through the back door, the evening chill hitting my face, and sank onto the steps, my hands gripping my knees to keep from shaking. The drizzle had turned to steady rain, soaking my blouse, but I didn't care. My mother's life, her fear, her flight from my father, was now a spectacle dissected by people who'd never known her. I saw her in my mind, not the trembling woman counting cash, but the one who'd braid my hair, her fingers gentle, her voice humming a lullaby. That woman was gone, and I'd kept her secret only to have it ripped away in a room full of strangers. Footsteps crunched behind me, and I tensed, expecting Tessa. But it was Clara, her umbrella bobbing, her face lit by the glow of a street lamp. She stopped a few feet away, her voice cutting through the rain. I knew something was off, Hannah. Your mother's past, this criminal father, it explains everything. You've been lying to us all along. I stood, my fists clenched, water dripping from my hair. Lying I was protecting her. You don't know what she went through. Clara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Protecting her or hiding your own secrets. You come here, work with our kids, handle our money, and now we find out you're tied to a fraudster. We deserve better. Her words were a slap, each one sharper than the last. I wanted to shout that I wasn't my father, that I'd spent my life trying to be invisible, not dangerous. But my voice broke, a sob choking me. You're wrong, I whispered, but it sounded weak, drowned by the rain. She shook her head, turning back to the library. The board will decide what's right, but I'll make sure this town knows who you really are. I watched her go, her silhouette swallowed by the door, and sank back onto the steps, my body trembling. The rain plastered my clothes to my skin cold, seeping into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside. Clara wasn't just questioning me. She was rewriting my life, painting me as a threat. And the board they'd heard Tessa's report seen my tears. What chance did I have now? I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen blurry through the rain. Ethan had texted back finally. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I should have told you about Dad." My breath caught. Dad? The word felt foreign, tied to a man I barely remembered, a shadow my mother fled. I opened the message, my fingers numb, and read on. "He hurt her bad. I was too young to help, but I knew. I didn't want you to carry it." The words blurred not from the rain, but from fresh tears. Ethan knew. All these years, he'd carried the truth about our father's abuse, letting me live in the dark, following my mother's rules without question. I'd trusted him, needed him, and he'd left me to face this alone. The betrayal cut deeper than Clara's accusations, sharper than Tessa's meddling. My brother, the one person who should have stood by me, had chosen silence. I shoved the phone away, my hands covering my face. The library door opened again, and I braced myself. But it was Greg, his boots splashing through puddles. He sat beside me, silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice low. "My sister? She ran from a man like your dad. People judged her too. You don't have to face this alone, Hannah." I looked at him, his face kind but blurred through my tears. "They think I'm a liar, Greg. Clara's making me a monster." He nodded, his jaw tight. "She's wrong, but you've got to tell your side or she'll bury you." I wanted to believe him, to find strength in his words, but all I felt was exhaustion, like every piece of me was crumbling. The board was still inside, deciding my fate, and Clara was rallying the town against me. My mother's secret, Ethan's silence, Tessa's betrayal, they were chains pulling me under. I leaned against the steps, the rain soaking me through, and closed my eyes, my heart raw, my fight gone. I didn't know how to face that room again, didn't know if I could. The rain had slowed to a mist, but I was still soaked, sitting on the library steps with Greg beside me. His words hung in the air, urging me to fight, but my body felt hollow, like Clara's accusations, and Tessa's betrayal had carved out everything I was. I wiped my face, the cold numbing my fingers, and looked at Greg. His eyes were steady, waiting, and for the first time I saw a way through the fog, faint but real. I couldn't let Clara win, not like this. I stood my legs unsteady and brushed the water from my blouse. "I need to go somewhere," I said, my voice rough but firm. Greg nodded, not asking where, just handed me his jacket. I draped it over my shoulders, its warmth a small anchor, and walked into the night, my boots splashing through puddles. The library's lights glowed behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew what I had to do. My bike was locked by the library, but I didn't take it. I needed to move to feel the ground under me, so I walked the town quiet, except for the drip of rain from eaves. My apartment felt too small, too close to the chaos, so I headed to the only place that made sense, the cemetery where my mother rested. It was a mile out past the diner and the gas station, the road lined with oaks that swayed in the wind. My breath steamed in the cool air, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. The cemetery gate was open, its iron bars slick with mist. I stepped through my shoes, sinking into the grass, and wove between headstones until I reached her grave. Diane Mitchell. The simple marker read, with dates that didn't capture her life, her love, her fear. I knelt the ground cold through my jeans and touched the stone its surface smooth under my fingers. Mom, I whispered, my voice breaking. I tried to keep your secret, but it's killing me. I sat back, pulling Greg's jacket tighter and let the silence settle. I'd come here before, after her death, seeking answers she couldn't give. But tonight was different. Clara's words, Tessa's investigator, Ethan's confession they'd torn open wounds I'd ignored, and I couldn't keep running. My mother had lived in shadows, her cash a shield against a man who'd broken her. I'd followed her path, not because I understood, but because I loved her. Now I saw it for what it was, a cage, not a sanctuary. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the wallet, its leather damp but familiar. I opened it, the note about Richard still inside, its words a ghost of her fear. I'm done hiding, I said, my voice louder, steadier. You wanted me safe, but this isn't living. I'm going to tell them, Mom, all of it. I'm going to take my life back. The words felt like a vow carved into the night. I stood, my knees aching, and looked at the sky, the clouds parting to show a sliver of moon. For the first time, I felt a spark, not of anger or shame, but of purpose. Clara thought she could bury me, but she didn't know. Me didn't know the strength my mother had passed down, even through her fear. I slipped the wallet back into my pocket, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what I was fighting for. I walked home, the town asleep around me, and let myself into my apartment. The quiet was different now, not oppressive, but expectant. I changed out of my wet clothes, pulling on a dry sweater, and sat at my kitchen table, a single bulb, casting soft light. I pulled out a notebook, one I used for grocery lists, and started writing. Not a defense, not an apology, but my truth, my mother's story, her escape, her reasons for cash, and how I'd carried them without question. The pen moved fast, my hand cramping, but I didn't stop. I wrote about her late-night whispers, her hands folding bills, her eyes scanning for threats that never came. I wrote about my childhood, the way I'd mimic her, thinking it was normal, thinking it was love. I wrote about the town, how their judgment had cracked me open, and how I was done letting it define me. The pages filled my words, raw but clear, and with each one I felt lighter, like I was shedding years of silence. I paused, my eyes burning, and looked at the clock. It was past midnight, the world still, but inside me something was shifting. I wasn't ready to face the board again, not yet, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. Clara wanted a fight, and I was going to give her one, not with shouts or tears, but with the truth my mother never had the chance to tell. I closed the notebook, my heart steady, and stood feeling the first stirrings of a strength I'd forgotten I had. The kitchen light flickered as I set the notebook down, my hand cramped from writing. The pages were filled with my mother's story, my story words I'd never dared speak. I stood and paced the small room, my bare feet cold against the linoleum, the weight of what came next pressing on me. I'd decided to tell the truth, but how Clara's accusations had poisoned the town and the board's decision loomed like a storm. I needed a plan, a way to reclaim my voice without letting them tear me apart. I poured a glass of water, the taps sputter loud in the quiet, and sat back down, staring at the wallet on the table. It wasn't just leather and stitches. It was my mother's armor, her way of surviving. But I wasn't her, not anymore. I opened it, pulling out the cash inside a mix of 5s and 20s, and spread them across the table. Each bill felt like a choice I'd made, a life I'd let her fear define. I pushed them aside and picked up my phone, scrolling to Greg's number. Greg, I said when he answered, my voice steady despite the hour. You mentioned a community meeting. Can we still do it? I need to talk to them, all of them. He didn't hesitate. My barn's free Saturday. I'll spread the word. You sure about this, Hannah? I have to be, I said, and hung up, a knot loosening in my chest. Greg's barn was a weathered space on his property, used for town gatherings, big enough for anyone who'd listen. It wasn't the library, not Clara's turf, but mine, a place to stand and speak. I leaned back, the chair creaking, and felt a surge of something new, not just resolve, but defiance. Clara wanted to paint me as a liar. I'd show them who I was. The next morning, I called in sick to the library, something I'd never done. My suspension was pending the board's review, but I couldn't face the stacks, not yet. Instead, I biked to the edge of town, where the credit union sat, a squat building with a faded sign. I'd passed it 1,000 times, always looking away, my mother's warnings about banks loud in my head. Today I locked my bike and walked inside the glass doors, heavy under my hands. The teller, a woman named Joyce, with kind eyes, smiled as I approached. Opening an account, she asked, sliding a form across the counter. I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah, first time. She didn't ask why, just walked me through the paperwork, her voice calm as I filled in my name, my address, my life on lines I'd always avoided. I handed over a check from my last paycheck, one I'd never cashed, and watched her process it. The machine hummed, printing a receipt, and I felt a shift, like a lock clicking open. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was here, traceable, real. Back home, I sat on my couch, the new debit card in my hand, its plastic cool and foreign. I turned it over, my name embossed in silver, and a small laugh escaped me, sharp and unexpected. It was just a card, but it was mine, a step away from the shadows. I tucked it into my wallet next to the note from my mother, and felt her presence not as fear, but as love urging me forward. Friday came, and I spent it preparing, rewriting my speech in the notebook, practicing in front of my bathroom mirror. My reflection looked different, my shoulders straighter, my eyes clearer. I thought of Clara, her smug certainty, and Tessa, her reckless digging. They'd hurt me, but they'd also woken me up. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was choosing to stand, to speak, to be seen. Saturday morning, I biked to Greg's barn, the air crisp with the first hint of fall. The barn was already filling, folding chairs scattered across the dirt floor, people murmuring as they arrived. Nathan was there, setting up a coffee table, and gave me a nod, his usual joking gone. Clara sat near the front, her purse on her lap, her face unreadable. Tessa stood at the back, her arms crossed, her eyes darting to mine before looking away. I didn't care. This wasn't about them. Greg clapped me on the shoulder as I stepped inside, his voice low. You've got this. Just tell them what you told me. I nodded, my stomach churning, but my resolve firm. I set my notebook on a hay bale, my speech memorized, and scanned the crowd. There were faces. I knew the grocer, the diner waitress kids I'd read to at story hour. They were my town, my home, and I was done letting fear take that from me. I took a breath, my hands steady, and stepped forward, ready to speak. But before I could, Tessa moved from the back, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Hannah, I need to say something first. I froze, my heart lurching, but she didn't wait for permission. I messed up digging into your life, hiring that investigator. I thought I was helping, but I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Her words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. The crowd shifted eyes on me, waiting. I looked at Tessa, her face open, her regret real, and something softened inside me. I didn't trust her, not yet, but I saw her, a young woman who'd stumbled, not a villain. I nodded just once and turned to the crowd, my voice finding its strength. My mother, Diane, was a survivor. I began, my words clear, filling the barn. She fled an abusive man, my father, and used cash to keep us safe. I carried that habit not because I'm a criminal, but because I loved her, because I didn't know how else to live. The room was silent. Every face turned to me, and I kept going. My mother's story pouring out my own woven through it. I spoke of her courage, her sacrifice, the weight I'd carried without question. I didn't look at Clara, didn't need to. This wasn't for her. It was for me, for my mother, for the life I was claiming. When I finished, the barn was still the air thick with something I couldn't name. I stepped back, my hands falling to my sides, and met Greg's eyes, his nod a quiet anchor. I'd done it, spoken my truth, and though the fight wasn't over, I felt it, a strength that wasn't loud or fierce, but deep-rooted. I stood there, the crowd's murmurs rising, and let the moment hold me. My gaze steady, my heart, finally, my own. The barn's silence lingered as I stepped back from the hay bale, my words still echoing in my ears. The crowd's faces blurred a mix of shock and something softer, maybe understanding. I stood there, my hands loose at my sides, the weight of speaking my truth settling like dust after a gust. Greg gave me a small nod from the side, his eyes steady, and I felt a flicker of relief, but it was fragile, easily snuffed out. I'd laid my mother's life bare, and now I waited braced for what came next. People began to move chairs, scraping voices rising in low murmurs. Nathan approached, his hands in his pockets, his usual grin replaced by a quiet respect. "That took guts, Hannah," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry I doubted you." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with the unexpected warmth of his words. Others followed, a slow trickle of neighbors offering nods or brief words, their eyes no longer sharp with suspicion. The grocer, Mr. Daniels, squeezed my shoulder, his calloused hand heavy but kind. I scanned the room for Clara, expecting her to stand to challenge me, but she sat still, her purse clutched tight, her face unreadable. It wasn't victory, not yet, but her silence was louder than any accusation she'd thrown before. I turned away, my chest loosening, and caught Tessa lingering by the barn door. She didn't approach, just watched her expression, a tangle of guilt and hope. I held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Forgiveness wasn't there, not today. Greg ushered people toward the coffee table, the crowd thinning as they mingled, their voices a soft hum. I slipped outside, needing air, and leaned against the barn's weathered wood, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. My debit card, new and stiff in my wallet, pressed against my hip, a reminder of the steps I'd taken. I'd spoken, opened a bank account, faced the town, but the ground beneath me still felt unsteady, like I was waiting for it to crack. Back inside, I helped Greg fold chairs, the clank of metal grounding me. He didn't push me to talk, just worked beside me, his presence solid. As we stacked the last chair, he said, "Library called me this morning. They're reinstating you effective Monday. Board's dropping the review." I stopped, my hands gripping the chair's edge, the words sinking in slow. "They're letting me back." My voice was small, disbelieving. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Your speech got around before you even gave it. People talked, Hannah. They see you now." I exhaled, my shoulders sagging, the relief sharp but laced with caution. The library was my haven, my life, and getting it back felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But Clara's silence, the town's shift. It wasn't the end. I'd opened a door and I couldn't close it now. I thanked Greg and stepped outside again, the air cooler now, the sky streaked with pink. At home, I found a letter slipped under my door, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar. It was from Mrs. Larson, the library regular, short and simple. Your mother sounds like she was strong. So are you. Keep going. I read it twice, my eyes stinging, and tucked it into my notebook next to my speech. It was one voice, but it mattered, a thread connecting me to this place I'd almost lost. The next day, I walked to the corner store, my debit card in hand. Sam the clerk raised an eyebrow as I swiped it for a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. "New trick, Hannah?" he asked, his tone light but curious. "Trying something different," I said, smiling the card's beep, a small triumph. I left the store, the bag swinging at my side, and felt the town around me. Its streets, familiar but new. People nodded as I passed, not all of them, but enough. The whispers hadn't stopped, I knew that, but they were quieter, drowned out by the truth I'd shared. Back at my apartment, I sat on the couch, the wallet on the table unopened. I didn't need to count the cash tonight. Instead, I pulled out a photo of my mother, one I'd kept hidden in a drawer, her smile bright, her arm around me at a county fair years ago. I propped it on the shelf, no frame, just her face in the open where it belonged. I looked at it, my chest tight, but not with pain, and felt her with me, not as a shadow, but as light. But then, a knock at the door jolted me. It was Clara, her coat buttoned high, her eyes sharp, but different, softer. She didn't wait for an invitation, just spoke, her voice low. "I was wrong about you, Hannah. I ran from a man once too long ago. Kept it quiet like your mom. I shouldn't have judged." I stood frozen, her words a weight I hadn't expected. Her admission was raw, a crack in the armor she'd worn, and it stopped me cold. I wanted to respond to bridge the gap, but my voice caught, and all I could do was nod, the moment heavy with unspoken understanding. Clara's words hung in the air. Her confession, a stone dropped into still water. I stood in my doorway, my hand on the knob, her face lit by the porch light. Her eyes held mine, not with the sharpness I'd known, but with something raw, unguarded. I nodded again, unable to speak, and she turned her steps slow down the stairs. I closed the door, the locks clicked loud in the quiet, and leaned against it, my breath shallow. Her apology was a gift I hadn't expected, but it didn't erase the scars she'd left. I sank onto the couch, the apartment dim, the hum of the fridge, my only company. Clara's story, her own escape, mirrored my mother's in a way that unsettled me. I'd seen her as the enemy, but she was just another woman carrying ghosts. It didn't make her right, but it made her human, and that was harder to hold on to than anger. I glanced at my mother's photo on the shelf, her smile steady, and wished I could ask her how to navigate this, how to forgive without forgetting. The next morning, I walked to the library, my debit card in my wallet, the weight of cash lighter now. The reinstatement letter had come, slipped under my door, with Clara's note, and I'd read it 3 times, each word a small reclamation. But as I unlocked the library, the familiar creak of the door felt different, like stepping into a house after a fire. I set my bag on the desk, the stacks silent, and waited for the day to begin, my nerves taut. Tessa was there, shelving books in the fiction section, her movements careful, like she was afraid to break something. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and offered a hesitant smile. "Welcome back, Hannah," she said, her voice soft. "I'm glad you're here." I nodded, my lips tight. "Thanks." I wanted to say more to bridge the gap her apology had opened, but the hurt was still there, a bruise not yet faded. She didn't push, just returned to her work, and I busied myself with overdue notices, the routine, a fragile anchor. By noon, the library was busy, kids darting through the children's section, regulars browsing magazines. I was checking out a stack of novels for a teenager when my phone buzzed, a Chicago number I didn't recognize. I stepped into the break room, closing the door, and answered. It was Ethan, his voice rough like he hadn't slept. "Hannah, I'm coming to town," he said, no preamble. "I saw the article about your speech. It's online, some local paper. I should have been there, not left you to deal with this alone." I gripped the phone, my pulse quickening. "Article? What article? Some reporter, Mia, something wrote about your talk at the barn. It's spreading, Hannah. People are sharing it, saying you're brave. I'm proud of you, but I'm sorry I wasn't." I sat on a folding chair, the room spinning. My speech, my mother's story was out there beyond the barn, beyond this town. Ethan's pride was a warmth I hadn't felt from him in years. But the article, the exposure, tightened my chest. I'd wanted to be seen, but not like this, not so far, so fast. "When are you coming?" I asked, my voice flat. "Tomorrow," he said. "I want to make this right, Hannah. We're family." I hung up my hands, trembling, and stared at the break room's peeling paint. Ethan's return was a lifeline, but it came with strings, memories of his silence, his choice to let me carry our mother's weight alone. I wanted him here, but I didn't trust the ease of his words, not yet. Back at the desk, I worked through the afternoon, my mind split between Ethan's call and the article I hadn't seen. A patron, Mrs. Carter, lingered after checking out a cookbook, her eyes soft. "I read about you," she said, her voice low. "What you said about your mom. It hit me hard. My daughter's in a bad spot, and your story, it's giving me hope." Her words were a jolt, unexpected and heavy. I managed a smile, thanking her, but inside, I was reeling. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was touching lives, changing them, and that power scared me. I finished my shift, locking up as the sun dipped low, and walked home, the town's streets familiar, but altered like a book I'd read 100 times and only now understood. At my apartment, I found the article online, Mia's byline bold on a local news site. It was detailed my speech woven with quotes from Greg Nathan, even Tessa painting me as a survivor. A voice for the silent. The comments were a mix, some praising my courage, others questioning my motives, calling it a stunt. I closed my laptop, my stomach churning, and sat in the dark, the glow of a street lamp cutting through my blinds. Ethan's call, Clara's confession, the article, Mrs. Carter's words, they were ripples from my choice to speak, but they didn't feel like triumph. They felt like a tide pulling me somewhere I couldn't control. I curled up on the couch, my mother's photo watching me, and let the weight of it all press down my breath, slow, my heart quiet, caught in a moment too big to hold. Months had passed since the barn and the town had settled into a new rhythm, one I was learning to trust. I woke early, the October light soft through my window, and stretched my body looser than it had been in years. The library was mine again, its stacks a quiet refuge, and I'd grown used to the debit card in my wallet, its weight a small freedom. I dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, the air crisp as I stepped outside, my breath visible in the morning chill. I walked to the park, a habit I'd picked up, the gravel path crunching under my boots. The leaves were turning bursts of red and gold against the gray sky, and I let myself linger, watching squirrels chase each other up a maple. The park was empty, just me and the rustle of branches, and I sat on a wooden bench, its paint chipped but sturdy. I closed my eyes, the breeze cool on my face, and felt a stillness I hadn't known was possible. The article, Ethan's visit, Clara's confession, they'd stirred waves, but those waves were calming now. I'd gone back to work, shelving books, reading to kids, and the townsfolk's nods were warmer, their eyes less guarded. Not everyone had changed, some still whispered, but I didn't flinch anymore. I'd carried my mother's fear for so long, let it shape every choice. But here in this quiet park, I was just Hannah, not a secret, not a shadow. I pulled a small journal from my pocket one I'd started after the barn, its pages filled with thoughts I'd never shared. I wrote about the library's smell of ink and wood, the way a child's laugh could lift a heavy day. Today, I jotted down the park's colors, the way the leaves fell slow, like they were choosing their moment. Writing grounded me away to hold on to this new lightness, to make it real. As I tucked the journal away, footsteps approached, soft but deliberate. It was Nathan, his jacket zipped high, a book under his arm. He'd become a friend, not close, but steady, showing up at the library with coffee or a bad joke. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice easy. I scooted over the bench, creaking. "Only if you don't talk about work." He laughed, sitting down, and opened his book, a worn copy of Steinbeck. "Deal. But I'm starting a book club, and you're invited. Thought you might like to pick a novel, maybe something your mom loved." I looked at him, surprised, the mention of my mother soft but piercing. She'd read to me at night, her voice weaving stories of far-off places, and one book stood out, a tattered copy of Anne of Green Gables she'd kept by her bed. Maybe I said my voice quiet. She liked stories about strong girls. Nathan nodded, not pushing, and we sat in silence, the park alive around us. His offer was small, but it carried weight, a bridge to a past I'd once buried. I thought of my mother, not her fear, but her laughter, rare but bright when we'd act out scenes from her books. I'd locked those memories away, afraid they'd hurt. But now, they felt like gifts, pieces of her I could carry without pain. I stood brushing leaves from my jeans and glanced at the sky clouds parting to show a sliver of blue. "I should get to work," I said, but my voice was lighter, the words less a duty than a choice. Nathan waved, already lost in his book, and I walked on the path, curving toward town. The library waited, its doors open, and I felt a pull, not of obligation, but of belonging. At my apartment that evening, I stood at my window, the town's lights flickering below. I'd spent so long hiding, checking locks, counting cash. But now, I stood still, the glass cool against my palm. I thought of my journal, its pages a map of this new life, and felt my mother with me, not in warnings, but in the way she'd smile when I'd read to her, my voice stumbling over big words. I was finding my way, not running, not hiding, just living. And it was enough for now. The library closed early that day, a rare quiet before the weekend, and I locked the doors, the key cool in my hand. The street was hushed, just the hum of a distant car and the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. I didn't bike home. Instead, I walked the long way past the hardware store and the church, my scarf loose around my neck. The air smelled of wood smoke, sharp and clean, and I let it fill me each breath, a small act of staying present. Ethan had arrived the week before, his suitcase still unpacked in my spare room. He'd shown up at dusk, his face lined with a tiredness I hadn't seen before, and we'd talked not about our father or the article, but about small things the way we used to. Last night, we'd sat at my kitchen table, a pizza box between us, and he'd pulled out a photo album, one he'd kept from our old house. The pages were brittle. The pictures faded, but there we were. Kids in mismatched socks, my mother kneeling beside us, her hair tied back with a red ribbon. "Found this in storage," Ethan said, his voice low. "Thought you'd want it." I'd traced her face. Her smile caught mid-laugh and felt a pang, not of loss, but of gratitude. She'd carried so much, hid so much, but she'd given us moments like that, bright against the dark. I didn't cry, just nodded, and Ethan squeezed my hand, his silence louder than words. We were rebuilding, not the kids we'd been, but something new, fragile, but honest. Now walking home, I thought of that album tucked on my shelf beside my journal. It wasn't a relic to hide anymore, but a piece of who I was. I turned down a side street, the houses glowing with early evening light, and stopped at a small lot I'd passed 100 times. It was empty, just dirt and weeds, but a sign announced a community garden project set to start in spring. I stood there, hands in my pockets, imagining rows of green kids digging with plastic shovels, neighbors sharing tomatoes. It felt like a promise, something this town could grow into. Back at my apartment, Ethan was on the couch reading a dog-eared paperback. He looked up, his eyes softer than they'd been in years. "You're late," he teased, but his tone was warm. "Got distracted," I said, kicking off my boots, thinking about planting something. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask, just handed me a mug of tea, steam curling from the rim. I took it, the warmth seeping into my palms, and sat beside him. We didn't talk, just sipped our drinks, the quiet, comfortable like a blanket we'd both needed. I thought of my mother, how she'd sit with us like this, her hands wrapped around a cup, her presence enough. I'd spent so long chasing her secrets, but here with Ethan, I saw her clearer, not in fear, but in love. Later, I stepped onto my balcony, the night cool and starless. The town spread out below its lights, steady, no longer a threat. I leaned against the railing, my tea gone cold, and let my mind drift. I'd fought for this place for myself, and though the scars remained, they didn't define me. I was Hannah the librarian who read to kids who walked the park, who wrote in a journal under lamplight. My mother's story was mine, but it wasn't all of me. I went inside, grabbing a small wooden box from my dresser. Inside was a packet of seeds marigolds bought on a whim months ago. I held them, the paper crinkling, and decided I'd plant them in that community garden, not for show, but for me, for the roots I was finally letting grow. I set the box down, my hands still, and stood in the doorway, the apartment quiet, Ethan's soft snores drifting from the couch. The world felt gentle, just for a moment, and I breathed it in, slow and deep, letting it hold me. A year had passed since the barn, and the town felt like a different place. Or maybe I was the one who'd changed. I woke to the soft hum of my alarm, the May light filtering through my curtains, painting stripes across my quilt. I stretched my bare feet, brushing the cool hardwood, and padded to the kitchen where a new coffee maker gurgled a splurge I'd allowed myself. The smell filled the apartment, rich and grounding, a small ritual that started my days. I dressed in a cotton blouse and khakis, my hair pulled into a loose bun, and grabbed my bag, the debit card, now a familiar weight in my wallet. The library was a short walk, the streets alive with spring kids on scooters, neighbors tending flower beds. I waved to Mr. Daniels at the grocery, his smile easy, no longer tinged with questions. The whispers had faded, not gone, but distant like a song you barely hear. At the library, I unlocked the doors, the air inside cool and faintly sweet, like old paper and polish. My desk was tidy, a stack of new children's books waiting to be cataloged, their covers bright with dragons and stars. I ran my fingers over them, smiling, and thought of the kids who'd come for story hour, their eyes wide, their giggles a kind of magic. This place was my anchor, not just a job, but a home I'd fought to keep. Mid-morning, I was shelving poetry when a woman approached, her arms full of cookbooks. She was new to town, her accent soft, maybe southern. "You're Hannah, right?" she asked, setting the books down. "Heard you help with the women's shelter." I nodded, a warmth spreading in my chest. "I volunteer when I can. They do good work." She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I'm thinking of donating. Your story, what you shared, it's why I'm here. Makes me feel like I can start over too." Her words landed soft, like a hand on my shoulder. I thanked her, my voice steady, and checked out her books. But inside, I was reeling, not with fear, but with a quiet awe. My story, once a wound, was now a bridge touching lives I'd never know. I watched her leave her stepladder and felt my mother's presence, not in secrets, but in the strength she'd passed to me, the kind that grew in silence. After lunch, I slipped out to the community garden, a project I'd joined when the lot opened. My marigolds were blooming, their orange petals vivid against the earth. I knelt, pulling weeds, the dirt cool under my nails. A girl, maybe 10, was planting carrots nearby, her braid swinging as she worked. "Yours are pretty," she said, pointing to my flowers. "Thanks," I said, brushing soil from my hands. "They're tough, these ones. Keep growing no matter what." She grinned, and I saw myself in her, curious, unburdened. I'd started gardening to root myself here, to feel the earth, and know I belonged. Each bloom was a choice, a step away from the shadows I'd lived in. I stood stretching and looked at the garden, its rows messy but alive, a mirror of this life I was building. Back at the library, the afternoon passed in a blur of patrons and paperwork. I was locking up when Greg called, his voice bright through the phone. "Got an idea," he said. "A memorial at the shelter for survivors like your mom. You in?" I paused, the key still in the lock, my heart full but calm. "Yeah," I said, "I'm in." I hung up, the evening air soft against my face, and walked home, the town wrapping around me like a familiar coat. My apartment was quiet, the coffee maker cold, but I didn't mind. I sat at my table, a single lamp glowing, and opened my journal, its pages nearly full. I wrote about the garden, the woman at the library, Greg's call, each word a thread in the tapestry of this new life. I set the pen down, my hands still, and breathed the world gentle, the past, a whisper I no longer feared. The memorial took shape over weeks, a quiet project that grew in the shelter's backyard. I stood there now, the June sun warm on my shoulders, a simple stone bench at the center of a small garden. Greg had carved the words himself for survivors in memory. I traced the letters, the granite smooth under my fingertips, and felt a stillness, not heavy, but deep, like a river finding its course. This wasn't just for my mother, but for every woman who'd run, who'd fought, who'd carried silence to survive. I'd spent the morning planting lavender around the bench, its scent sharp and soothing. A few shelter volunteers joined me, their hands in the dirt, their stories shared in quiet moments. One woman, Sarah, spoke of leaving a man who'd left bruises she hid for years. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear, and I saw my mother in her, not in fear, but in the courage it took to start again. I listened, nodding, my hands muddy, and felt a connection not just to her, but to something bigger, a thread tying us all. Back home, I sat on my couch, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table. Ethan had left for Chicago, but not before we'd cooked one last meal together, a pot of chili from our mother's recipe, the kitchen filled with its smoky warmth. He'd hugged me, his arms tight, and promised to visit again, no more years of silence. I believed him not because it was easy, but because we'd both chosen to try. I sipped my tea, the ice clinking, and looked around my apartment, its walls no longer a hiding place, but a home. I thought of Clara, how we'd met for coffee last month, her hands nervous around her mug. She'd apologized again, her voice low, and shared more of her story, a marriage she'd escaped decades ago. I didn't forgive her right away, but I listened, and in time, I saw her not as the woman who'd judged me, but as someone who'd been afraid too. That understanding wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet shift, like turning a page to find the stories changed. The article had faded from the headlines, but its ripples lingered. I'd get emails sometimes from strangers who'd read it, women who saw themselves in my mother's flight men, who thanked me for speaking up. I answered when I could, my words simple, and each reply felt like planting another seed, small but real. I wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd stopped running, and that was enough. I stood crossing to my window, the town spread out below, its lights soft in the dusk. I'd lived here for years, always looking over my shoulder, but now I saw it clear: the diner's neon sign, the park's swaying trees, the library's steady brick. This was my place, not perfect, but mine. I'd learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but carrying it differently, letting it shape you without breaking you. My mother's fear had kept us safe, but her love had kept us whole, and I was finally living for both. The lesson wasn't grand or loud. It was this truth: even when it hurts, sets you free, not all at once, but in the small moments, the ones you choose to face. I'd hidden for so long, thinking it was strength, but real strength was standing in the open, letting the world see you, flaws and all. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of Clara's judgment, not of my father's shadow, not of my own heart. I ask you, what truth have you held back, afraid it would break you? Share it below if you're ready, because your story matters too. If this moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening, for being here, and I wish you the courage to find your own light wherever you are.